Okay, so let's unpack this. We have a pretty monumental stack of sources today. I mean, they cover everything from the American post-Civil War era, like right up to the modern age of AI. What do you even get when you try and connect someone like Andrew Carnegie, writing this private confession about the moral degradation of hoarding wealth, and then a Singaporean tycoon who gets this ridiculously cheap deal, totally untendered, and then Jeff Bezos talking about needing like messy decentralization? What's the
The
link?
link is the ultimate insider. That's what you get. These stories, well, they're not just about smart ideas or pure innovation, are they? They're really case studies in mastering these unwritten rules, the hidden rules of ultimate power. These figures didn't just, play by the rules that were there. They actively shaped the playing field. They maximized secrecy. They made sure the system itself, whether it was a government regulator or a whole global supply chain, was basically tilted in their favor.
Right. And that's really our mission today, isn't it? We're diving deep into all this evidence, looking at how the world's most powerful billionaires, from those Gilded Age Railroad guys to the tech CEOs we see now, how they actually got and kept these massive fortunes. We want to pull out the consistent strategies, things like leveraging political connections, obviously,
Yeah.
getting market control through speed and secrecy, and that tricky balancing act between pure self-interest and, well, looking like you care about the public good.
Exactly. We're trying to look past the polished PR story here. We want to uncover how controlling the essential infrastructure, controlling information, and now increasingly controlling just raw data, how that gave these figures these permanent, non-competitive profit engines. And this stretches across, what, 2 centuries of global capitalism?
Yeah, it's a long thread. So let's start right back at the beginning then, where this kind of blueprint for modern industrial ruthlessness was really first hammered out the late 19th century, okay, the Gilded Age. If you
Uh-huh.
look closely, you can really see the foundations of modern corporate strategy being laid.
hmm
And maybe the biggest cornerstone was just secrecy. John D. Rockefeller, he was like the absolute master of evasion, wasn't he? He set the gold standard for keeping operations opaque.
Oh, definitely. His core strategy, it was consistent and pretty simple.
Yeah.
Just to give out as little information as you possibly can,
Yeah.
whether it's to the public or to regulators.
It wasn't just accidental, though. It was deliberate policy.
Right, absolutely. It was intentional corporate policy. It was designed to help them survive scrutiny. We actually see this internal advice where one of his associates, a guy named Paul Babcock, he explicitly told Rockefeller how to handle the public's antitrust fever, as he called it. And the advice was fascinating. He said, use answers that were perfectly truthful, right, but also evasive of bottom facts. Think about that phrasing.
Evasive of bottom facts. Yeah.
You're telling the truth, legally speaking, but you're successfully hiding the actual operational reality of your monopoly.
That difference between the legal truth and the bottom facts, that really feels like the heart of the insider game, doesn't it? And the sheer scale of that deception. I mean, it was basically invisible until Rockefeller was forced, wasn't he? A huge pressure to finally release the 1882 Standard Oil Trust Agreement publicly.
Yeah, and that release was like an earthquake because it just ripped the curtain back and forced them to reveal, what was it, 41 associated companies that had never, ever publicly admitted any connection to the Standard Oil Trust before that.
Hmm.
So for decades, the public, most regulators, they had absolutely no idea that all these apparently independent businesses were just, arms of this one giant central monopolistic entity.
So the secrecy was protection. And when that protection was breached, like with investigative journalists, Rockefeller's reaction tells you a lot about what he really feared. He saw people like Ida Tarbell as much more dangerous than other critics. Why?
And his reason is so revealing. He said, she makes a pretense of fairness. And beneath that pretense, she slips into her history, all sorts of evil and prejudicial stuff. See, Rockefeller wasn't really worried about just crude attacks or accusations. He was worried about a credible story, a sustained narrative that actually used his own facts against him to pierce that carefully built image of propriety he had. He got that, real integrity in the press, solid investigation. That was the only thing that could genuinely challenge his structural power.
Okay, so if Rockefeller mastered operational secrecy, let's switch to Andrew Carnegie. Because he seemed to have more of a maybe philosophical struggle with his wealth. He was apparently really affected when the former British Prime Minister Gladstone slammed American millionaires. Gladstone warned that just wanting to hoard wealth was the lowest form of intellectual degradation.
Yeah, and Carnegie took that criticism quite seriously, it seems. He actually wrote this quite startling confession saying he really intended to avoid that moral degradation.
Huh?
He famously came up with and pushed his gospel of wealth, which basically argued that millionaires had a duty to act as, like, trustees for the public good,
Right.
distribute their wealth. But this high-minded moral calculus was constantly bumping up against the realities of his business needs.
Right. That's the core contradiction, isn't it? The big ideas versus the, well, brute force needed to control a business. We see that so clearly in how he dealt with his partner, H.C. Frick, the guy who founded Frick Coke.
Oh, Frick was absolutely essential because he controlled Carnegie's critical supply of coke, that refined coal you need to make steel. So when Frick tried to make this temporary and actually illegal pooling agreement with a competitor just to keep coke prices stable, Carnegie, who was the main stockholder, he jumped in immediately.
Even though Carnegie used pools himself when it suited him. But he came down hard on Frick and demanded something much more permanent, much more ruthless.
Exactly. He demanded practical consolidation. That was his phrase.
Yep.
That was the only thing he'd accept, not some temporary pool. He wanted total vertical integration. He wanted ownership. Why? Because temporary deals were too risky. And in his view, they were illegal, mainly because they could be broken. So you see, the lofty talk about giving away wealth, it always took a backseat to the absolute necessity of total business control, protecting his supply lines, protecting his investment. The permanent structural advantage always won out over the temporary fix.
That idea, the permanent structural advantage, that brings us nicely to Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
He built his empire controlling physical infrastructure, the ships, the railroads, and there's this massive irony, isn't there, between his public statements and his private actions.
Well, Vanderbilt is the perfect example of Gilded Age hypocrisy. Publicly, he's out there proclaiming his deep belief in unfettered trade and unrestrained competition, playing a part of the free market champion.
But then, almost straight after saying that, 9 months later, he's secretly conspiring to build a complete monopoly over California's absolutely vital steamship lines. What, that a huge switch?
Because he spotted the power of a geographical choke point. Simple as that. His move was pure, cold, hard logistics. He figured out that the route through Nicaragua gave him a permanent structural edge over the existing Panama lines. The Nicaragua route was just significantly shorter.
Okay, shorter route. Why did that matter so much back then?
2 words. Coal costs. Coal is incredibly expensive to ship and store, especially way over on the Pacific side of the journey. Vanderbilt did the math. He calculated that the shorter Nicaraguan route saved him at least $5,000 in operating costs just on the Pacific leg alone. And that saving was mostly coal. Now, $5,000 in the 1850s, that was an absolutely monumental amount of money. And here's the key. This wasn't some temporary discount he was offering. It was a permanent, built-in structural advantage. It guaranteed him higher profit margins, even if he matched every single fare his competitors charged. That's the core idea. Controlling the essential infrastructure makes you the market maker, not just another player in the market.
It's really fascinating when you lay it out like that, because the playbook, fundamentally, it hasn't really changed much, has it? These early guys, they understood that controlling the physical stuff, railroads, shipping, oil pipelines, and controlling the information about it all, that gave them permanent, non-competitive ways to make money that just beat simple market innovation every single time. And these strategies, they didn't stay in America, did they? They got exported pretty quickly around the world.
Oh, yeah. Because the logic holds anywhere, especially when an economy is developing really fast or maybe when the regulatory oversight is deliberately kept weak. In those situations, the potential return you get from political leverage, from being an insider, it just dwarfs the return you get from simply trying to build better product.
So let's pivot then, look internationally, especially Asia in the, say, late 20th century. We see that Gilded Age blueprint just adapted for places where political connections are really the main currency. The rules of the game become explicitly political, right? And sometimes, yeah, explicitly criminal.
Yeah, when you look at how power worked, according to the sources on some of these Asian tycoons, the playbook they describe is, well, it's brutal, but it's also very pragmatic. These tycoons, they understood that in the environment they were operating in, they basically had to bribe as well as to lobby, to threaten as well as to persuade, and to tell a good many lies. That's a direct quote describing the situation.
Wow. That's a pretty stark way to describe your necessary operating environment.
It is. And maybe the most crucial insight here is that even though they might complain about corruption sometimes, ultimately, they end up defending that distorted environment, as the source calls it. Why? Because that distortion is what allows them to succeed. It creates these incredibly high barriers to entry that only they, the insiders with the right connections, can actually get over.
Okay, let's look at a specific example. Like Hushing's acquisition of the British conglomerate Hutchison Whampoa back in 1979. That seems like a perfect case study of leveraging political connections within that sort of colonial commercial system.
Oh, the Hutchison deal was absolutely legendary. It was seen as truly brilliant, but, brilliant for Lee. The real keys were, first, it was an untendered sale, which means it wasn't opened up to public bidding. So right away, market competition, eliminated, gone. Second, the price was set incredibly low. So low, in fact, that the company's estimated breakup value, what you'd get if you just sold off all its assets individually, was more than double what Lee actually paid for the whole thing.
Okay, so a massive bargain, completely shielded from any competition, but wasn't there another layer, something about how he paid for it?
Absolutely. He was also given a deferred payment option, which basically meant the immediate cost to him, the upfront cash he needed, was significantly reduced. So the result wasn't just that he got rich, it was that he became totally integrated into the political and commercial fabric of Hong Kong, what the sources call that cozy colonial commercial stitch-up.
Hmm.
He locked down his control over things like container ports and retail, and in return, he channeled huge amounts of banking business to the Hong Kong Bank. And what did they do? They immediately turned around and made him a non-executive deputy chairman. Power reinforcing wealth, which reinforces political standing. It's a cycle.
And we see the really toxic side of weak regulation even more starkly in Indonesia, right? With their banking deregulation in the late 80s, early 90s. The idea supposedly was good, fix corruption in the state banks. But the way they did it, it was a total disaster.
Yeah, it's a classic case of, like, creating a system but leaving a massive vacuum right in the middle of it. They allowed all this financial deregulation, banks could open easily, but they completely failed to put in place any kind of strong regulatory framework or, crucially, any enforcement mechanism.
And nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Yes.
Especially a regulatory one. Powerful interests are just going to rush in and fill it.
You got it. So something like 120 new banks just exploded onto the scene between 1988 and the mid-90s. And very quickly, these places stopped acting like normal banks trying to maximize shareholder return. Instead, they became essentially just sources of cheap money for the powerful figures, the godfathers, who controlled them. The critical mechanism here was something called related party lending. So there was actually a legal limit. Banks weren't supposed to lend more than 20% of their portfolio to companies owned by or affiliated with the bank's own owners.
Okay, a 20% limit. Was that generally respected?
Respected. It was almost completely ignored. Take Jamsil Nursalim's bank, Dagang Negara Indonesia, BDNI. Internal investigations later found that companies affiliated with Nursalim received over 90% of the bank's total lending. 90%. So the bank wasn't really funding outside businesses at all. It was just acting as a captive piggy bank for the owners of their ventures. And of course, when the Asian financial crisis hit in 97, 98, those banks just imploded immediately because the collateral for those loans was often worthless or didn't even exist. And who was left holding the bag? The public system? The taxpayers.
It really shows how that insider game, when you play it globally, it often depends on capturing the regulators or just having no effective regulation at all. And then you can do the self-dealing that basically transfers all the risk onto the public or the system while you privatize all the profit. The Ambani family in India seems to have perfected this through, careful political cultivation combined with media control.
Dhirubhai Ambani was apparently a master lobbyist. His company, Reliance, actually hired a guy named V. Balasubramaniam as a full-time lobbyist. He operated right out of the Ashoka Hotel in New Delhi, like right in the center of power. But the influence model went way beyond just, checking in with regulators about specific policies. Ambani apparently had this ability to just captivate politicians and bankers with his sheer business vision, his ambition.
It was more of a long game strategy, wasn't it? The sources talk about how if a politician or a banker, maybe later in their career, perhaps after retirement, faced some kind of self-interest issue or financial difficulty, Reliance would conveniently step in.
Exactly. They'd offer specific, very generous opportunities, maybe a nice post-retirement job, maybe a business opportunity for their son or daughter, or even just some well-placed, inspired publicity to boost their image.
It's like a delayed quid pro quo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Building up this whole web of personal obligation and loyalty that goes way beyond simple policy lobbying. And this power, it also extended to controlling the public story, making sure the media stayed, cooperative enough.
Oh, definitely. There's this specific incident mentioned where a newspaper dared to print just one hostile paragraph about Reliance, apparently fed to them by a rival company. Reliance's reaction was immediate.
They pulled their ads.
Instantly.
Yeah.
canceled all advertising with that paper. And we're talking about a loss of, I think it was as far as 600,000 a year back then, which for a major city newspaper at that time, that was a huge chunk of their operating revenue. It's pure economic leverage, used like a surgical tool.
It's the ultimate lesson in corporate power over journalism, I guess.
Like you're saying.
And you want our ad money, make sure the coverage is sufficiently positive.
And the lesson was learned very quickly. The sources confirmed the paper promptly ran a very long and favorable article about Reliance, and poof, the ads were restored. Ambani always brushed off criticism as just jealousy, but the record suggests they were often the first ones to use every tool they had, political, economic, to, as the source puts it, put a spoke in a rival's wheels.
So this pattern, control the story, control the politicians, control the money flow, that was like the essential toolkit for building massive wealth globally. But then with the rise of technology, the assets themselves started to change, didn't they? We moved from controlling things like coal and shipping to controlling speed and data.
Right. So if the Gilded Age was all about controlling those physical choke points, the digital age really kicked off by controlling the operating system. Bill Gates basically laid the foundation for Microsoft's empire with that crucial deal to sell MS-DOS to IBM for their first PC.
Yeah, that was absolutely the defining moment, wasn't it? It gave them that initial guaranteed stream of income. But just as importantly, maybe more importantly, it established MS-DOS as the industry standard. And Gates immediately adopted that same Gilded Age mentality. Market elimination, not just competition. He famously vowed he would put his major software competitors right out of business.
And he wasn't just competing on having a better product. He used price like a weapon, didn't he? A weapon for market conquest. Absolutely. You look at Digital Research's competing operating system, CP/M. It was priced at $240. MS-DOS initially came in at, what, a quarter of that price. But Gates apparently even suggested something more radical. He talked about maybe putting DOS in the public domain entirely, just for a while, specifically to kill off CP/M for good. I mean, that's total war, isn't it? Using price, using distribution tactics, just to achieve permanent market eradication, making sure his structural dominance couldn't be challenged.
That kind of structural ambition seems to define the next wave of tech titans too, especially someone like Jeff Bezos at Amazon. Bezos often talked about Amazon's rise, including AWS, as this messy process, right? Claiming there was no aha moment. He even argued the strategic chaos actually made Amazon a confusing target for its big rivals, like Walmart.
It's a really compelling story, that whole chaos of innovation narrative. But you have to wonder, wasn't that messy process sometimes just a useful smokescreen? Critics definitely argued it was often just intentional obfuscation, hiding these incredibly centralized, almost monopolistic ambitions.
Yeah, it feels like it might have been both things at once. Genuine, relentless innovation, but always fueled by this central desire for total, absolute control. Amazon didn't just want to sell books better. They wanted to control the entire infrastructure of book selling. They set up Lab 126 specifically to disrupt their own physical book business with the Kindle. And then through things like Encore and CreateSpace, Amazon positioned itself to basically control the entire value chain of publishing.
The clear intention was to cut the major publishing houses out of the loop entirely. They wanted to manage everything, right from the author hitting submit to the final delivery to the reader. It's exactly like Rockefeller's vertical integration, isn't it? But instead of oil wells and pipelines, it's authors, servers, and delivery trucks.
And doing that, it required this almost fanatical corporate culture. The sources say anyone who couldn't fully channel Bezos' fervor, that absolute unyielding commitment to Amazon's hypergrowth, they just didn't last. Ex-employees even called the really dedicated ones the Jeff bots. The system didn't just demand performance, it demanded total ideological buy-in to the Amazon way.
And this relentless pursuit of extreme growth, often growth that wasn't even profitable, that really defined the late 2010s, didn't it? You look at Adam Neumann at WeWork. He was apparently obsessed with doubling WeWork's revenue every single year, growing faster than Uber, faster than Airbnb. He kept claiming WeWork was this global physical platform, trying desperately to make it sound like more than just, well, a real estate company leasing office space.
And this focus on the big vision over actual results, over profitability, it was actively encouraged by investors like SoftBank, wasn't it? It created this kind of perverse incentive where early investors were almost fighting each other to just push more money into these young startups. Speed, scale, the grand story that became way more important than whether the business actually worked long term.
Yeah, and you see the same use of speed as a weapon with Uber. They openly used guerrilla tactics to just overwhelm slow-moving city governments and the old taxi operators. Staff members, like Austin Geit mentioned in Seattle, They acted like paratroopers. Their job was to just land in a city, build up ridership and market share as fast as humanly possible before the city could even figure out how to regulate them. Speed became a form of regulatory arbitrage. If you move fast enough, the rules literally can't catch up with you.
Okay, so this is where the ultimate insider game in the modern era really seems to come together. The ultimate resource isn't just cash anymore, or even market share. It's incredibly granular consumer data collected at a massive scale. And this is starting to fundamentally shift the geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a major split emerging between the US and China in the AI race, and a huge part of it comes down to data access. While US tech firms are obviously still incredibly strong, China seems to be making these huge strategic plays towards global leadership, largely by controlling the fine details of daily life through data collection.
And that advantage comes from China's huge O2O boom, right? The online to offline economy.
Exactly. That whole ecosystem gave Chinese companies just tremendous data on what people do in their physical offline lives. We're talking about, what meals they order, where they get massages, where they commute every day. It's like having a real-time, high-resolution map of everyday activities, all captured through digital payments and linked services. But the real game changer, the data behemoth, is probably the Internet of Things, or IoT. Specifically, that massive bike-sharing explosion. This didn't just provide bikes, it created these enormous networks of IoT-connected transportation devices. Devices that trace literally tens of millions of commutes, trips to the shop, every little movement within a city. The sources argue this data is far greater in quantity and much more detailed, much more granular than the data held by companies like Uber or Lyft in the West.
Okay, that sounds like a technical difference, but what's the big strategic implication here?
The implication is structural power, pure and simple. Think about it. If the Gilded Age robber barons got their power by controlling the routes of physical commerce, like the railroads and shipping lanes, then these modern data giants are controlling the flow of human movement itself, and maybe even human intention. Having this deep, systemic knowledge about how cities actually function, how people move, how resources get distributed, the argument is that this is poised to tilt the geopolitical landscape toward China. It gives them this incredibly powerful strategic edge in things like AI development, urban planning, logistics, surveillance. The ultimate insider now. It might just be the entity holding the biggest, best, most comprehensive data set.
So all these stratagems we've talked about, from Gilded Age secrecy and consolidation right through to modern data harvesting and platform control, they've had these really profound system-wide consequences for society. Probably the most obvious ones are this deepening chasm of wealth inequality, and then the way that concentrated wealth gets used to influence politics and governance at the very highest levels.
Yeah, and this huge systemic shift, it was kind of given philosophical cover by economists like Milton Friedman, wasn't it? He really championed that idea that the sole purpose of a corporation is to maximize profits for its shareholders, period, at almost any cost. This thinking really laid the groundwork for what we now call the age of shareholder supremacy, where investors come before absolutely everyone else, employees, communities, the environment.
And Jack Welch at General Electric, he seems to have implemented this idea with, well, ruthless zeal. We're talking about GE making a massive $1.5 billion profit back in 1981, which is huge money then, and yet Welch still went ahead and laid off tens of thousands of workers. Why? Because he genuinely believed GE simply employed too many people. He fundamentally shifted the entire focus of the company away from long-term stability and employment towards just hitting those quarterly profit targets for Wall Street.
And the contrast the sources draw is pretty stark, isn't it? Welch is demanding things like commuting by helicopter for executives, apparently after giving the local town an ultimatum about it, while at the same time, he's firing employees who'd been with the company for decades. That period, the 80s, that really feels like the moment when the relationship between corporate profits and worker wages just fundamentally broke. You look at the stats. Back then, less than half of corporate profits typically went back to investors as dividends or buybacks. But over the last decade, that figure has soared to something like 93%. Almost all the value being generated by major corporations is now flowing straight to the top executives and the shareholders, not to the broader workforce.
Wow, 93%. That data really helps you grasp Thomas Piketty's central idea, doesn't it? That inequality equation he talks about, where the return on capital is consistently greater than the rate of economic growth.
Right, that's like the hidden engine driving inequality. If you think about it simply, if you rely on a salary or wages for your income, your wealth tends to grow roughly at the same rate as the overall economy, which is G. It grows, but relatively slowly.
Mm.
But if you already have significant capital investments, property, stocks, that capital tends to grow at the rate R, the return on capital, and R is consistently higher than G. So the wealthy are essentially playing a different game, one where the rules almost guarantee their money grows faster than anyone who's just earning a paycheck.
Mm.
They only need to reinvest a small fraction of their returns each year for their total fortune to just accelerate away from average incomes.
And we see the direct results in that massive wage gap, right? There was that study mention of British companies listed on the stock market. It found that if the company's value went up by 10%, the CEO's pay typically went up by about 3%, but the average worker's pay, it only went up by a tiny 0.2%.
Exactly. Almost all the value created by the firm gets captured right at the very top.
Yeah.
By the C-suite and the biggest shareholders. And then this incredibly concentrated wealth, once it's accumulated, it doesn't just sit there, does it? It cycles right back into the political system. It becomes this overwhelming force for lobbying, for political influence, often channeled through these murky mechanisms we tend to call dark money.
Yeah, like the example of the Koch brothers, the rich, conservative industrialists. They defend all the money they spend fighting environmental regulations and taxes as being, public-spirited, helping the economy, promoting freedom. But what did their own associates say about it?
Well, one associate apparently called their tax-exempt giving network a shell game. Plain and simple. Why? Because giving money this way is preferable to just paying taxes. And they use these nonprofit organizations to effectively blend their corporate lobbying goals with their supposed charitable work. It makes it, as the associate said, another form of lobbying. So the political impact is still controlled entirely by the donors, pushing policies that directly benefit their core fossil fuel businesses, but the public effectively subsidizes it all through the tax exemption. They're advancing their private interests while claiming it's all philanthropy.
And it's important to note, this isn't just a tactic used on one side of the political aisle, is it? We see similar patterns with wealthy liberal donors using their capital to try and shape policy outcomes.
Oh, certainly. The example given is George Soros. Back in 2004, strongly opposing the Iraq War, he funneled over $27 million into these outside spending groups specifically, things called 527 groups. These 527s, they're named after a section of the U.S. tax code, right? They're tax-exempt organizations specifically designed to influence political campaigns and outcomes. It represents this huge flow of independent, often hard-to-trace capital into the political process. So whether you're looking at conservative donors or liberal ones, massive personal wealth is consistently being used as a tool to try and tilt the political landscape in favor of specific agendas or interests.
So if we try and tie all these threads together, it really raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? If the ultimate goal of the ultimate insider is basically just to use whatever environment they find themselves in, whether it's leveraging a monopoly or data supremacy or pure political influence, just to extract the maximum possible profit, how much power should we as a society be granting to these individuals, especially when their financial success often seems intentionally disconnected from or even detrimental to national or public interests?
Yeah, when you start to realize that the heroic image we often get of the bold innovator, the risk-taking entrepreneur, is frequently just cover for these deeply entrenched political maneuvers or structural advantages, then your whole definition of success has to change, doesn't it? The ultimate insider, they don't really see the political and regulatory environment as a set of rules they need to follow. They see it as a landscape of opportunity, an opportunity for extraction, for leverage. They adapt their methods over time, maybe moving from controlling railroads to controlling digital data streams, but that core intent, it stays remarkably constant. Find or create a permanent choke point and then exploit it.
Which brings us right back to where we started this whole deep dive. We've seen that whether you're talking about Gilded Age trusts like Standard Oil, or global tycoons manipulating weak governance like Li Ka-shing, or modern tech platforms building data empires like Amazon, the core tools for building and keeping massive wealth seem to rely on the same fundamentals: leveraging inside information, being absolutely ruthless in crushing or acquiring your competition, and always maintaining that critical, often very transactional closeness to political and financial power.
The financial tools might look different now. They're digitized. The scale is just mind-boggling compared to the past, but yeah. The fundamental mechanics of how power is acquired and maintained, they seem remarkably, maybe even depressingly consistent across centuries.
The story of the modern financial world really seems to be one where political access, that insider status, often makes the difference between whether a deal is hailed as a stroke of genius, like Lee Ka-shing's Hutchison deal, or exposed later as blatant corruption, like those Indonesian banks funding their owners' empires. So, considering this incredibly powerful and consistent pattern where structural control and insider status seem to guarantee success almost regardless of market ethics, you have to ask, how much has that essential relationship between money and power really changed since Cornelius Vanderbilt was secretly conspiring to monopolize those shipping lanes way back in the 1850s? That continuity, stretching right across centuries of capitalism, well, that's definitely a thought worth sitting with.